Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this very important and special edition of a Johnny Vedmore read through. Possibly one of the most, yes, I'm going to say it, important articles I've ever written. It's true. There's no joke here, and there really isn't a joke here. My cat's even come to join in because she knows how important this article is. It is the Wellcome Five, the proximal origin of COVID control. And it may be a little long tonight because this is a long article. When I originally went to write this article, I got about, I'd say, a tenth of the way in, hardly anything, when I realized I had to actually write another article first. And we'll do a read through of that article eventually, but I really want to get straight to this one. I needed to do the other article because I needed to really give people an idea of who Brian Spratt was and his relationship with the report writing and the reviews of leaks from Porton Down being the biological weapons site for the Ministry of Defense. Oh yeah, that's where we're going. That's where we're going. You know us. We like to go to the MOD. We like to get right up there ourselves, don't we? Yes, we do. Hello, Kat. How do you feel? My cat feels very good about this. She knows it's going to be good. There are five of the Wellcome Five. Originally, it was going to be like Wellcome 11 because there was so many. There are actually so many. But when I got to the point of trying to define which were the 11 who went in, I kind of like narrowed it down, and it kept being extremely clear that there were five main people. So the article is originally modeled on Ocean's 11 in that sense. Wellcome 5 was originally Wellcome 11. And the actual cover is a mock-up of the cover for the original Ocean's 11 movie, not the remake with George Clooney and stuff, but the original one with, I think, Sammy Davis Jr. and the like in it. All of the Rat Pack. It was one of the Rat Pack movies once upon a time. And writing this article was just really frustrating because I knew even when I put it was out amongst the censorship and it would take a long time for people to understand. I also had another problem. It was meant to go up on Unlimited Hangout, and it was one of the many times that me and Whitney broke up during that period. So it was really suspicious, to be honest, because it was the day before I was meant to publish this, and everything just suddenly, like, we changed from being friends to me being an enemy all of a sudden. It's happened four times, so I wasn't surprised about it. But it meant that basically I had to then go and publish this article myself without my reach. And it was one of the most, I think, important articles through COVID to understand, because everybody was looking at the American part of the operation. It was missing loads of bits, missing loads of sections. When you looked at people like Peter Danzak, all of the people who were Bill Gates and the like, the people who were the front and center in the American cover-up rollout, whatever it was, flood the zone, all of this stuff happening. What people were missing out was that it was a massive British contingent that was employed to do the main parts of the mapping out how this was going to work. And they had to be away from government. They had to be distant from government. You could not have them close to government. So this was a very important article, the Wellcome Five article, likely to cause trouble still in the future, I'm sure. And we should probably get straight into it, just because, like I say, this is a long article. It was I was planning it to be about 7,500 words, and it ended up being 15,000. So it's basically a small, a mini book. Um, and here you are. We're on johnnyvedmore.com. Yes, look, this is johnnyvedmore.com. I changed it a bit. You can buy me a coffee at the top. That's one of the best ways to support me, is just donate me some funds. And you've got lots of different things here. I mean, you've got the menus at the top now. I've tried to make everything much simpler so you can see all the articles. There's a lot of articles there. And then there's, of course, a lot of the posts that come up on johnnyvedmore.com, some of the keyword searches, become a patron, buy me a coffee. Um, Thanks for buying me a coffee if you have. You can support my journalism easy just by scan and pay, and PayPal at the bottom too. Loads of ways to support the work. I need your help now more than ever if I'm going to continue doing this work. And as we see here, like I say, it's a mock-up of the Ocean's 11, the original Ocean's 11 cover. So Edward C. Holmes, Neil Ferguson, what's his bloody name? I always forget his bloody name. I don't. Richard Sykes. It's really annoying because it's easy to remember Jeremy Farrar, Roy Anderson, Neil Ferguson, and Edward C. Holmes, but it's always hard because he's like the top guy. This is why he's front and center there, really front and center. He is your top guy, Richard Sykes. We'll go through all of this. So you see, the cast is there. Roy Anderson, Jeremy Farrar, Neil Ferguson, Edward C. Holmes with Richard Sykes, Brian Spratt, Andrew Rambo, Crystal Donnelly, included special guests Robert May, John Krebs, and Christian G. Anderson. No one forget Christian G. Anderson. Last but not least, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. You see, I had chosen 11 at the end of it, but still, that's the way it goes. And here it is. It's called The Wellcome Five, the Proximal Origin of COVID Control. And here we go. Let's do this read through. Thank you for joining me. If you can like, share, and subscribe, that'd be good. Support me if you can, so I can keep doing this sort of work. No one pays me for this, and in fact, I get to the end, I think I'm going to get an article up, and then it gets denied at the last minute because obviously, look at these articles. So, as draconian COVID-19 control structures rise up around us, Johnny Vedmore, me, talking in the third person here, investigates a very small group of close friends linked to a powerful philanthropic organization, the Wellcome Trust, who are responsible for some of the most defining events of the COVID-19 era. In this article, we will look into the proximal origin of the Wellcome Five, Jeremy Farrar, Richard Sykes, Roy Anderson, Edward Holmes, and Neil Ferguson, and their band of scientific mercenaries. There is a small group of elite British scientists who have been busy manipulating the COVID-19 crisis to benefit a hidden agenda. These core players at the center of creating authoritarian control structures under the guise of a COVID response have major connections to the Wellcome Trust, an ostensibly philanthropic endeavor known for funding medical research. These individuals' efforts began long before the COVID era and even include first engineering the creation of a modern-day Wellcome Trust as a byproduct of the birth of a pharmaceutical giant, GlaxoSmithKline. This team of men are responsible for key components of global COVID-19 response, the infamous Proximal Origin paper, the implementation of the entire UK vaccine rollout, and so much more. Yet barely anyone knows a single name of the Wellcome Five. At the beginning of January 2020, many people had no idea whatsoever about what was soon to unfold, but there was a handful of scientists from a very small group of elite British institutions who seemed to be well prepared for the coming storm. In fact, these men were not only made responsible for organizing extremely key events throughout the pandemic response, they were also responsible for pioneering the pandemic computer modeling methods used to send shockwaves of fear throughout the world. They had also helped fund the research of many prominent supporters of their agenda and had even implemented a very similar totalitarian lockdown in response to a seemingly manufactured epidemic in the United Kingdom 2 decades before. On that occasion, these men became more powerful than any elected politician and were responsible for burning pyres of dead animals that, thanks to their discredited models, littered the British countryside. This article will examine a core group of British elite scientists who are all close friends and colleagues and have historic ties to the modern incarnation of the Wellcome Trust. During COVID-19, one member of this small group of unaccountable actors, Jeremy Farrar, has been given almost absolute power over designing the WHO's global response to the pandemic. The same man led the production of the Proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2 paper over a 10-day period in a seemingly brazen attempt to cover up the true laboratory origins of the COVID-19 virus. In examining Farrar's history, I discovered that this very small group of friends were all intricately involved in the modern evolution of pandemic responses, and that they had pioneered large parts of the modeling techniques used to manufacture consent to introduce draconian lockdowns in the Anglo-American world, which were then adopted as a gold standard in model pandemic responses by other nations globally. Whilst the events I map out will give you a basic idea of the history and structure of this extremely powerful and effective team of Wellcome Trust-linked scientists, they are not the only group like this active during COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, this behavior is paralleled in other organizations across the globe who have all helped create this paradigm of authoritarian control we are experiencing today. It is our jobs as researchers and journalists to define these clandestine operations as best we can. I will continue to work at defining this particular operational unit emanating from the upper echelons of the Wellcome Trust. But others must do their part too. Defining the structure of any shadowy outfit involved in the organization of such tyranny is not a simple task, but it must start somewhere. Oh, they're getting a bit normal. It must start somewhere. As countries all around the world have been implementing harsh authoritarian responses to the COVID-19 crisis and pushed for further restrictions to their citizens' freedom, it is more important than ever to look into this core band of unaccountable scientists who have been responsible for much of what we see today. For without the Wellcome Five, much of this nightmare wouldn't have been possible. Welcome to Wellcome. The Wellcome Trust is a philanthropic organization which funds large amounts of scientific research globally. The scientific grants given out by Wellcome are extremely lucrative and sometimes stretch over a researcher's entire career. The Wellcome Trust was established to administer the fortune of the American-born British pharmaceutical magnate Sir Henry Wellcome. It was initially entirely funded by income from Burroughs Wellcome, an early pharmaceutical giant which had been pioneers of medical technology still used today. The trust was later renamed in the UK as the Wellcome Foundation Limited. In 1995, the Wellcome Trust divested itself of any interest in pharmaceuticals by selling all remaining Wellcome plc stock to Glaxo plc and, in doing so, creating Glaxo Wellcome plc. In 2000, the Wellcome name disappeared from the drug business altogether when Glaxo Wellcome merged with SmithKline Beecham to form GlaxoSmithKline plc, essentially removing the Wellcome name from the private sector. This period of change saw the Trust's activities and their focus shifting to recruiting and funding the very best scientists coming out of the United Kingdom's most prestigious universities. Before 2020, the Wellcome Trust was not a household name, and its employees and representatives had been relatively free from any outside scrutiny. However, a few well-connected men tied to the Wellcome Trust have been responsible for key parts of the disastrous and overly authoritarian official COVID-19 response in the UK, as well as having a massive impact and influence on responses globally. These powerful men formed their current operational unit in the mid-90s, rising from the Wellcome Trust rebranding during the same period. They used the fear of disease to take power on two definable occasions. Firstly, during the British foot-and-mouth disease epidemic of 2001, and then again during COVID-19. In the mid-90s, the Wellcome Trust was created anew as a philanthropic foundation. However, that didn't mean they left the pharmaceutical industry entirely. In reality, the Trust used the great wealth they had amassed to fund large parts of modern scientific research at some of the most prestigious establishments, which not only aided the big pharmaceutical giants by proxy, but also allowed the people at Wellcome to redesign the direction of research to suit their allies within the pharmaceutical industry. Another benefit for Wellcome was that this system allowed them to recruit and groom an entire generation of scientists to advance the organization's agenda. Whilst the vast majority of scientists and researchers who are funded by the Wellcome Trust's lucrative grant scheme are likely completely unaware of the foundation's true political reach and power, they are often working as small cogs in a machine which they cannot really see from their relatively ground-level perspectives. When inspected closely, the Wellcome machine also appears to provide a mechanism for the UK Ministry of Defence or its allies abroad to continue potentially catastrophic gain-of-function experimentation while simultaneously being able to quickly cover up any lab leaks when they do happen. In this article, I will show you just a very small part of that machine, focusing on its very select 5 people who are all connected by the focused recruitment drive in 1994. In that year, the core of this group, Richard Sykes, Roy Anderson, who brought his colleague Neil Ferguson and Brian Spratt along with him, Edward C. Holmes and Jeremy Farrar created the processes and funding to recruit large swathes of those who now stand in their extremely who now stand on their extreme end of the public COVID-19 debate. Although I will specifically mention one incident of career-long funding for 35 graduates during this article, this group also gave out large long-term grants to hundreds of other top scientific graduates from 1994 onwards. These men went on to redesign the entire face of pandemic modeling and response, as well as being responsible for the creation of multiple suspicious origin stories, including the infamous proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2 paper. From the very beginning of the COVID-19 story, these men have played globally significant roles, including Edward C. Holmes' translation of the original SARS-CoV-2 genomic sequence on 11th of January 2020, Farrar being given complete control over coordinating the entire COVID response by US and UK governments, outranking both Fauci in the US and Whitty in the UK. Ferguson and Anderson's apocalyptic-looking COVID-19 computer modeling. Holmes and Farrar's organization of the proximal origin paper cover-up, and Sykes being put in charge of the entire vaccine rollout in the UK and promotion of the related vaccine innovation and technology. All of the aforementioned roles should have been tasked to officials who were elected by people, but instead we have witnessed events being manufactured in such a way that it is almost impossible to hold any one official to account. These people, again, I've moved it too fast, lost place. These people connected to the Wellcome Trust have been pivotal in creating a medical autocracy to which the public never consented. In this article, I will attempt to show how they have demonstrated a pattern of behavior in the past, which has been repeated through, during COVID-19. I will reveal how this select group of very close personal friends have been rolled out by the Ministry of Defense in the past to take part in official inquiries, only going on to certify that the government version of events which could cause further public only going on to certify the government's versions of any events which could cause further public scrutiny. I will show you as much as I can in one article. Firstly, let's go to the top tier. Top tier, Richard Sykes, the Glaxo man and vaccine king. King of the North. Richard Sykes is a man of great significance to not only the reformation of the Wellcome Trust in the mid-90s, but also for his supreme position on the official UK vaccine rollout during COVID-19. In 2020, Sykes led an independent review of the workings of the Vaccine Task Force. And on the 14th of June 2021, Sykes was appointed chair of the Vaccine Task Force. In this position, he became responsible for overseeing the delivery of the UK's COVID-19 vaccines, including the preparation for further booster programs. Sir Richard Brooks Sykes was born 7th of August 1942 near Huddersfield in West Yorkshire to Eric and Muriel Sykes. He attended Royds Hall Grammar School, the same school former Prime Minister Harold Wilson had once attended. Even before he finished his initial schooling, Sykes had found work as a technician in the pathology laboratory. Sykes went on to be awarded a PhD in microbial biochemistry from Bristol University, and then, in 1972, he was recruited by Glaxo Research Limited as the head of Antibiotic Research Unit. The young Sykes later moved across the pond in 1979 to work for the Squibb Institute for Medical Research based in Princeton, New Jersey, where between 1983 and 1986 he was vice president of infectious and metabolic diseases. In 1986, he rejoined Glaxo in the UK as Deputy Chief Executive at Glaxo Group Research Limited, and also became the Group Research and Development Director of Glaxo plc. A year later, he became chairman, as well as being chief executive of Glaxo Group Research Limited. In March 1993, he was appointed deputy chairman and chief executive at Glaxo plc. In 1995, the recently knighted Sir Richard Sykes engineered the merger between Glaxo and Wellcome plc, which also saw the default creation of a new envisioning of the original Wellcome Trust, established as an independent charitable foundation. He then became chairman and chief executive at Glaxo Wellcome plc in May 1997. Stepping aside the following October, Glaxo Wellcome subsequently merged with SmithKline Beecham to form GlaxoSmithKline plc in 2000. In 1997, Richard Sykes, who insisted on being called Dr. Sykes, published various papers contemplating the future of pharmaceutical industry, and the following year wrote a paper on how to be a modern pharmaceutical company. In this paper, he argued for companies to share their scientific research data with each other. Between 1997 to 2008, Sykes was also classed as a senior independent director for Rio Tinto plc, the Anglo-Australian multinational and world's second largest metals and mining corporation, where Sykes served as chairman of the Remuneration Committee. Sykes was still serving as a non-executive director for Rio Tinto in 2003, when Sir John Kerr was also appointed as a non-executive director. Kerr had been a member of the UK Diplomatic Service for 36 years and its head from 1997 to 2002. I think we come across Kerr later. On 20th of May 2002, Sykes stood down as the chairman of GlaxoSmithKline plc at their annual general meeting to concentrate on his role as rector of Imperial College London. In 2003, Imperial College faced accusation of forgery in a prestigious medical journey after it was a journal. I do that all the time. After it was discovered that a member of their staff forged the signatures of 7 co-authors on the paper. Sykes led the investigation after the New England Journal of Medicine was forced to make a rare step of publishing a retraction. From 2008, Sykes became chairman of the NHS London. He stepped down in May 2010 over the decision of the Cameron government to stop the planned reorganisation of healthcare in London. Over the next decade, he took up various board positions at places such as Eurasian National Resources Corporation, Lonza Group, a company which later partnered with Moderna to manufacture and produce their COVID-19 vaccine, Net Scientific PLC, the Economic Development Board International, PDS Biotechnology, as well as others. From 2012 until 2018, he was the chairman of Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust. At this time, he also held such positions as the chairman of the Royal Institution of Great Britain and the Chancellor of Brunel University. There he is. That's Richard Sykes. Don't think I'd turn on the sound, but you'll be able to see him in action. He's actually in arguing with a load of people about stuff. He turns up, he seems to be like, for me, he's like a John Kenneth Galbraith character in a sense. He's very clever, pretending to be left-wing, but seems to work with everybody who's on the right. And yeah, so that's Richard Sykes there. In December 2020, Matt Hancock MP appointed Sir Richard to conduct an independent review of the strategy and goals of the Vaccine Task Force. He was later made chair of the UK government's Vaccine Task Force, a group which was responsible for achieving 3 main objectives. Let me just pause that while we go. Secure access to the most promising vaccines for the UK population as quickly as possible. 2. Make provisions for international distribution of vaccines so that the benefits of the UK leadership and investment in this area could be widely shared. And 3. Support the UK's industrial strategy by establishing a long-term vaccine strategy to prepare the UK for future pandemics. In June 2021, Richard Sykes was given an overall responsibility for overseeing the delivery of the COVID-19 vaccination program, including preparations for booster programs and encouraging vaccine innovations in the UK. In a UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy end-of-year report entitled UK Vaccine Task Force 2020 Achievements and Future Strategy, Sykes writes within the introduction, in 1998, as CEO of Glaxo Wellcome, I was instrumental in establishing and funding a three-way collaboration between government, industry and academia, designed to carry out the basic research necessary to develop and produce new vaccines. At the centre of the collaboration was a new research institute named after the British vaccine pioneer Edward Jenner and officially opened by Peter Mandelson. Ooh, nice Mandelson, the Secretary of State for Industry. Glaxo Wellcome made a commitment to fund the institute for 10 years, following which it struggled to obtain government support and eventually ended up at Oxford University. So I'm extremely supportive of a renewed approach to grow and strengthen the UK vaccine industry. Richard Sykes had been put in charge of the Vaccine Task Force to make sure things were done quickly, something he claims he helped achieve in the aforementioned paper, where he states, "The number one priority for any vaccine remains its safety. In the normal course of events, developing a new and novel vaccine from research to market would take a minimum of 10 years. In the present climate, the combination of ETF leadership and private sector research and development has reduced this time scale dramatically." In the rather self-absorbed example of Sykes' out of control or out of touch, rhetoric, I'm out of control. He claims that the fast rollout of the experimental vaccinations are due to a combination of VTF leadership and private sector research and development, rather than a decimation of usual safety protocols. One other very important note to come out of Sykes VTF is that he had managed to create what he described as several world-class clinical assets which supported the development of COVID-19 vaccines but will prove invaluable for future pandemics. These assets included the NHS Citizens Registry, which had over 360,000 people registered by December 2020. Sir Richard Sykes had been instrumental in engineering the creation of modern incarnation of the Wellcome Trust and GlaxoSmithKline. In the 1990s, as he was beginning his reformation of the two major pharmaceutical companies, Sykes had already formed a very defined vision of what he wanted to do. Sykes was not alone in enacting this vision of the future. His colleagues in the early 90s, Roy Anderson, who was then governor and director of the Wellcome Trust, helped Sykes to create what we are seeing and experiencing today. Oh man, Roy Anderson, so important. Sir Roy Anderson, the Lord of Lockdown and Extermination. Sir Roy Malcolm Anderson is a British professor of epidemiology and is the link that connects many of Britain's major modern pandemic responses and the majority of the official cover-ups related to those events. He also happened to be the pioneer of pandemic computer modeling, models which, when applied in the real-world situations, have often proven to be highly erroneous. Nevertheless, his importance to and influence on the events of the last quarter of a century cannot be understated. Sir Roy Anderson is the British establishment's man for all seasons when it comes to pandemics. Anderson was born on the 12th of April 1947 to James Anderson and Betty Watson Weatherbourne. He was educated at both Dunscombe School and Hertford Grammar School, and went on to study at Imperial College at the University of London. Between 1971 and 1973, Anderson was an IBM Research Fellow at the University of Oxford, and from there he went on to lecture for 4 years at King's College, University of London. Just quickly note, 1971 to 1973 was while IBM were running the limits to growth, depopulation, computer modeling for Club of Rome. Those years. Unbelievable. You can see where Roy Anderson come from. In the late 1970s, Anderson could be found lecturing at Imperial College London, where he was also noted as a reader. A reader denotes an appointment of a senior academic to a Commonwealth further educational establishment with a distinguished international reputation in research or scholarship. Between 1980 and 1982. In 1982, he became the professor of parasite ecology, and he became the head of the UCL's biology department 2 years later. He held these two positions until 1993, when he became the Linacre professor of zoology at Oxford University, a historic post first founded in 1860. That same year, Anderson was also installed as head of Department of Zoology. He was also named director of the Wellcome Trust. Anderson had already served as a governor at the Wellcome Trust, beginning just 2 years before, in 1991, and he went on to head this philanthropic organization until 2000, departing only when his behavior towards a particular lady at Oxford became an uncomfortable issue. Oh, yes, it did. Anderson received the establishment honour of being elected as the Fellow of the Royal Society in 1986, and he became known for working on the modelling of the AIDS virus. He subsequently became an advisor for the Thatcher government. He then began making media appearances, such as an interview Anderson gave on the 24th of September 1987, where he politely discussed the AIDS crisis with Colin Tudge on the British classical music station, BBC Radio 3. Anderson's opinions on AIDS was reported again in the then Robert Maxwell-owned Daily Mirror a year later, on the 10th of September 1988. He had made a speech to the Science Association at a meeting in Oxford where he was recorded as warning that the country may be on the borderline of an epidemic that could hit many heterosexuals. A survey conducted over the following year found that some AIDS experts were concerned about the fight against the disease being downgraded because of the public perception that it only threatened homosexuals and drug addicts. Remarkably, the survey's findings show that AIDS specialists believed that there were now medical advantages to treating HIV-infected periods before they developed full-blown AIDS. Treating HIV-infected people before they develop full-blown AIDS. The Liverpool Echo reported on the 28th of November 1989 that Professor Roy Anderson's prediction for the future of the spread of AIDS, with the article stating that he believed the pessimistic view is that the second wave of the epidemic will appear as intravenous drug users in 5 to 10 years' time. Anderson also stated that there might be a third wave affecting mainly heterosexuals on a longer time scale of 20 to 30 years. It should be noted that whilst Anderson was starting to talk publicly about the potential HIV treatments, Burroughs Wellcome, the then US pharmaceutical arm of UK's Wellcome plc, had started producing and marketing a new drug for HIV called AZT. The compound was the first drug to be approved by the US Food and Drug Administration for the treatment of what was called at the time acquired immune deficiency syndrome. In 1988, Roy Anderson was also making a name for himself among concerned mothers who didn't trust the MMR vaccine. On the 10th of September 1988, a report in Aberdeen Evening Express with the headline "Compulsory Jabs Urged" stated that children should not be allowed to attend primary school unless they have been vaccinated, according to a scientist. A small side note in the newspaper article goes on to say, Professor Roy Anderson of Imperial College London said many health regions achieve only 57% of immunization targets. This may be the first hint of Roy Anderson's penchant for using totalitarian policies to increase vaccine uptake. There's Roy Anderson there. In 1998, Anderson again became a government advisor, and he soon had his attention diverted towards a new variant of bovine spongiform encephalopathy, a progressive neurological disorder of cattle, which is commonly referred to as mad cow's disease. Some cattle in Britain during this era were being fed a meat and bone meal that included the remains of other potentially affected cattle. One of the main issues was that it took 4 to 5 years to show up in affected cows. This meant that by the time the cause was identified and rectified, the damage had already been done. BSC had been discovered in 1985 by a junior pathologist who identified a spongy brain disease in a Frisian cow. But the connection with the potentially new form of bovine encephalopathy had not been recognized by senior officials until 1987. In 1996, the UK government was advised that a new variant had been identified in humans, and later, in December 1997, it was announced that there was an inquiry into the history and emergence of BSE and the government's response to the crisis up until March 1996. The inquiry, which produced Roy Anderson as key witness, started on the 12th of January 1998. The BSE scandal was a well-managed affair. It needed to be, as the Conservative government of the day had found themselves in a bit of hot water. During the period of 1983 until 1991, Sir Donald Aikson had been the government's chief medical officer and had downplayed the risk of potential cross-species spread of the illness. A cat had been diagnosed with the illness, and even with the example of cross-species transmission of the disease, he had continuously recommended that it was safe to eat meat contaminated with BSE, stating clearly in 1990, British beef can be eaten safely by everyone. Aikson wasn't the only representative of the scientific entity at the time to be more concerned with sales of meat and milk than human health. The Southwood Working Party, which was led by Eric Millstone and a man named Patrick van Zwanberg, also claimed in the early 90s that the offal of infected cattle was safe for adults but not for babies. How they come to that decision. The disease was eventually transmitted to humans from the eating of contaminated beef. The original BSE inquiry mostly attempted to shift blame from the poorly managed response away from the government and onto the early stooges who had been tasked with playing down the risks. This moment was important in Anderson's development. His usefulness in managing the narrative of precarious public inquiry had been noted by the establishment, and he henceforth became a useful tool in the government's toolbox. By the late 90s, Anderson's prestigious career had also seen him daubed with various honorary positions, titles, and memberships, including his fellowship at the very exclusive Royal Society and the Zoological Society, as well as being a board member on many various international advisory panels. Some of these positions were jeopardized by his own behavior. In 1999, Anderson was suspended from his position at Oxford after he stated that a colleague of his had only got her promotion by sleeping around. The person he was targeting was Dr. Sunetra Gupta, who over 2 decades later opposed Anderson's extreme lockdown tactics during COVID crisis as a signatory of the Great Barrington Declaration. Notably, Gupta was married to Adrian Hill at this time, the man who has affiliations to the Wellcome Trust and who later co-headed the creation of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine during COVID-19 alongside Sarah Gilbert. At first, Anderson refused to retract his statements about Gupta or apologize in any form, but eventually he was allowed to return to his Oxford position under the condition that he write a private apology to the people he had slandered. Anderson may have agreed to this proverbial slap on the wrist by the Oxford authorities, but Dr. Gupta did not see this as an acceptable outcome. She demanded that he publicly retract his statement and that he also pay her a small amount of damages, which was to be donated to charity. The pathetic drama, all to protect the ego of a misogynistic elite scientist, did not lead to Anderson retaining his position. A vote of no confidence from the board at Oxford was unanimous, infuriating Anderson. He framed his departure with a positive spin. He had agreed with Imperial College London to move his research projects along with a grant worth over £7 million from the Wellcome Trust and his band of 70 research staff to the ICL facility. Snubbing Oxford publicly in what appears to have been a pathetic example of pure egotistical spite. Along with his research team, Professor Anderson brought with him Professor Brian Spratt and Neil Ferguson, his close friends and colleagues. Even though Anderson thought he'd been able to retain his position as director of the Wellcome Trust, it was financial irregularities which eventually saw Anderson removed from that specific position. It had surfaced that Anderson had an undeclared stake in a company receiving grants from the Wellcome Trust, whilst he was also part of the committee which approved such grants. The financial stake was large enough to have broken the rules, and along with Gupta's saga still fresh in the collective mind of his colleagues, Anderson stood down as the director of the Wellcome Trust. However, he still continued to receive grants and funding from them. Then, beginning In late 2000 and through 2001, Anderson and his team became central figures in one of the most controversial epidemic responses in British history. From foot in mouth to foot and mouth. Anderson's team made a bizarre change to their central focus of study in the closing months of 2000 and during their relocation to Imperial College. Although his team had been primarily focused on human pandemics and modeling of spread of human diseases, they suddenly, and without giving any public reasoning, diverted their focus to studying foot and mouth disease in November 2000. This sudden and dramatic sea change in focus was made even more strange given that there hadn't been a significant foot and mouth disease outbreak in Britain since the late 1960s. Anderson's research team at the time included Dr. Neil Ferguson and Dr. Crystal Donnelly. Their team had pioneered the use of computers for modeling the epidemiology of human diseases such as AIDS, malaria, and TB. Yet none of these researchers had any veterinary training or an understanding of the difference between modeling a human epidemic as opposed to an infectious outbreak in animals. The BSE crisis, which was only significant animal disease response Roy Anderson had previously been involved in, he had been related to contaminated cattle feed and was not spread like a traditional virus capable of causing an infectious epidemic. You get what I mean? The BSE crisis, which was the only significant animal disease response Roy Anderson had previously been involved in, had been related to contaminated cattle feed and not the spread of traditional virus capable of causing an infectious epidemic. Here you go. I understand it now. Coincidentally, a few months after Anderson's team had begun researching foot and mouth disease, Britain recorded its first outbreak of the disease in over 3 decades. The subsequent actions of Roy Anderson, Neil Ferguson, and their accomplices should be common knowledge, but thanks to another convenient inquiry set up to fail, they were never held to account for their part in what proved to be a devastating response to the great foot and mouth epidemic of 2001. This suspiciously convenient timing for an outbreak of foot and mouth put Anderson's team in a primary position to become government advisors. At the time, foot and mouth outbreaks were fought using a combination of methods. One of the most tried and tested ways was to control a foot and mouth disease outbreak was by using the vaccination ring method. Unlike humans, farm cattle did not usually travel long distances, and thus, once an infection was noted, you then cull affected animals and begin vaccinating all the livestock within 5-mile radius or 3-mile radius, working your way back towards the original infection site. This is meant to effectively stop any outbreak within a week or two. There were political reasons why mass vaccinations. Wait a minute, I done it again. I moved it too fast. Woohoo! There were political reasons why mass vaccination wasn't possible at the time, but a small vaccination ring alongside a focused cull had been successful in bringing recent FMD outbreaks in other countries under control quickly. The other methods, besides vaccinating, was culling the animals affected, and there are, of course, different levels of culling response. If the government involved in the epidemic wants to mitigate the financial damage to farmers, then a combination of testing, vaccinating, and culling can be very effective. However, it takes time, patience, persistence, and resources to do the whole process humanely, something the British government at the time, then led by Tony Blair, had no interest in. The MAFF, Ministry of Agriculture, Fishery and Food, which was soon after abolished and replaced by the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, had been trying to tackle the outbreak, but due to funding cuts made during the Thatcher government, their resources were insufficient for the task at hand. The FMD epidemic was a stage 3 outbreak by the time it was officially recognized, and it wasn't expected to be solved overnight. The MAFF needed more funding and resources if they were going to tackle the outbreak humanely. Anderson and Ferguson were soon brought in to advise the Blair government on the appropriate steps to take, and they went on to create computer models akin to Neil Ferguson's now infamous initial COVID-19 models. They predicted death and destruction on a scale beyond imagination of most, and asserted that this dire scenario would undoubtedly unfold if they did not immediately take over the design of the response to the epidemic from the Ministry of Animals, Fisheries and Farms. Blair gave them the power they desired. Blair's lack of resistance to Anderson and his extreme methods could have been greatly influenced by the upcoming general election, which was initially set to take place that May, only months away. What followed was a fear-based and unscientific culling of mostly unaffected animals. The countryside of Great Britain became littered with burning piles of livestock on a scale never seen before, and the mass killing of animals left farmers completely traumatized by these extreme intervention methods. The British Army were even brought in to enact the culling process. The British countryside was put into a lockdown, and unlike the COVID response, vaccines were vigorously attacked by Anderson as ineffective and likely to do more harm than good. This stance on vaccines represents an almost complete reversal when compared to our current paradigm. The FMD vaccines were widely considered very safe and mostly effective, and there had been no negative side effects reported on humans consuming milk and meat of the animals who had been given the vaccine. In addition, this vaccine had been used successfully to control FMD on almost every occasion it was used. In contrast, today's COVID vaccines are experimental, have many clear adverse reactions, and were not fully tried and tested beforehand. Yet the same people who have argued during the COVID pandemic for mass use of experimental vaccines had previously completely opposed a well-studied vaccine which had known risk profile. What the British people weren't being told at the time was how and where the outbreak really began, and the epidemic's plausible links to vaccine research. Research which is often argued needs gain-of-function experimentation to aid in the development of potent and effective vaccines. Let me just, well, oh no, how are we doing? Badly. Boo-boo. Ah! Well, I attempted to zoom in a bit, and that didn't really work, did it? Ah, there you go. Okay, so like I don't know, I don't know how far through we are, but I will say like, share, and subscribe. If you can throw me a few bucks for this hard work, then please do. I am in need of your support, especially on articles like this. This one will likely be censored as well. I'm not sure, how long it'll stay up, as some of these have been the first ones to be attacked during COVID. Okay, here we go. The first rumors of a potential lab leak emerged in an article originally released in the Evening Chronicle on the 5th of May 2001 entitled, "Did Scientists Start Foot and Mouth Plague?" The article revealed that there were 20 current foot and mouth disease experiments being conducted by the Institute of Animal Health at the Pirbright facility, including immune responses induced by foot and mouth disease vaccine, matching properties of foot and mouth disease virus strains in field strains, and transmission of foot and mouth disease in sheep. The article also reminds us that during the crisis, the International Vaccine Bank for Foot and Mouth Disease was based at Pirbright, Surrey, and at the time stored 500,000 doses of high-potency vaccines for each of the 7 different varieties of the disease. 500,000 doses. That's like a lot of doses to keep. Well, anyway. Anderson and Ferguson's computer modeling failed to help in bringing the outbreak under control, and with a general election coming up, the political situation was tense. What followed next was extraordinary public manipulation of data to make it look as though the FMD crisis cases were decreasing when they were not. Tony Blair postponed the general election for another month. The official data, like during the COVID era, began to be manipulated to suit government narrative and to aid the chances in the approaching election. The MAFF began changing the way in which they presented the statistics on the website. They began deleting the previous day's figures as well as declining to report the earlier stats. Soon they split the main number into three categories to play down the true totals. Anderson had his computer model show that the crisis was over, conveniently ending, or the crisis would be over, conveniently ending on the new general election date Tony Blair had called. But what the public hadn't been told was that the army had sped up the cull. The manipulation of the official government statistics left everyone who was attempting to calculate the actual number of culled animals completely baffled. No one knew the true figures anymore. Even the government's own leading scientific experts on FMD, Dr. Paul Kitching, criticized the approach of Anderson and Ferguson's computer modeling, saying, when interviewed, that Anderson's computer had certainly come up with some very seductive graphs, but the data available had been fed into the program was so inadequate that one has to question the value of the data coming out. Kitching was particularly critical about the change of election date from May to June, as well as the fact that the computer projections were being adjusted as the political situation advanced. After making those comments, Kitchen stated that he was resigning as deputy head of Pirbright Institute and was soon taking up a new post in Canada. When the public inquiry was called into the foot and mouth disease response, that was also heavily manipulated. The Blair government split the planned inquiry into three separate inquiries, each with different remits. This allowed Roy Anderson to remain completely unaccountable for the consequences of his actions. In addition, two of the people involved in the review were also connected with Roy Anderson, as the now defunct Warmwell website reports. What made this inquiry so particularly open to suspicion was the network of contacts intimately linked to the little group of scientists who had been at the center of the crisis since March and who had been personally responsible for some of the most questionable aspects of the way it was handled. The Royal Society's president, Sir Robert May, the former government's chief scientist who had played a key part in recommending another fellow of the Society, FRS, Professor David King, to succeed him as a chief scientist, and who had then stepped in to become Mr. Blair's chief advisor in the crisis. Another FRS was Sir Robert's former Oxford colleague, Sir John Krebs of the Food Standard Agency, who had played a key part in having Professor Roy Anderson, FRS, put in charge of government policy for controlling the epidemic. Professor Anderson had co-authored 2 books with his former colleague, Sir Robert May. The foot-and-mouth disease crisis is quite astounding when you compare it to COVID crisis. During FMD, Anderson and Ferguson produced a terrifying computer model, and this was central to the government response. They refused to consider anything but the harshest measures immediately and frowned upon any discussion of alternative policies. They used the army to slaughter millions of animals without any regard for the emotional and economic harm that they were causing on people or animals involved. When their models failed, they created a new model and publicly manipulated the figures. Anderson became all-powerful during FMD, and not even Blair dared to challenge him. The key components of this pattern repeated beginning in 2020. Ferguson produced a terrifying computer model, which became central to the response. They refused to use any other strategies with COVID other than the harshest measures available. There were again no discussions about alternative measures allowed. They used the medical establishment during COVID like they used the army during FMD, expecting and demanding drone-like obedience to what were probably illegal orders. Then, during COVID, when their models yet again failed, they began manipulating the numbers. Despite his role in the scandalous FMD response, in 2003, Anderson became a member of the World Health Organization (WHO) Advisory Group on SARS, as well as the Health Protection Agency (HIPAA) Advisory Group on SARS. In 2004, Roy Malcolm Anderson also became the chief scientific advisor to the UK Ministry of Defence until 2008, at which point he was installed as rector of Imperial College. These rich rewards for a man who had managed to create a public perception of success out of an entirely disastrous FMD crisis of 2001. Between 2005 and 2011, Anderson was made a member of Bill and Melinda Gates Scientific Advisory Board for the Initiative on Grand Challenges on Global Health. By 2007, the awards and accolades for Anderson were getting ridiculous. As well as becoming chairman of the World Health Organization's Science and Technology Advisory Board on neglected tropical diseases, he also became the governor of the Institute of Government, trustee of the National Natural History Museum, and a council member for the Royal College of Art, just to name a few. He also became a major advisor to various governments and national scientific bodies all across the globe, including in Malaysia, Thailand, Netherlands, Singapore, USA. He also boasts previous connections to institutions in Canada, Switzerland, and Germany. More than 5 years after the 2001 foot and mouth outbreak, another scare happened when cattle tested positive for the disease. On this occasion, they managed to catch the outbreak very early, and it wasn't allowed to spread. On that occasion, the government accepted that major lab breaches had happened at the Institute for Animal Health at Pirbright, which had led to the disease being released. In an article in the Irish Independent written on the 11th of September 2007 entitled Biosecurity Breaches Caused FMD, it states, 5 separate breaches of biosecurity at the Institute of Animal Affairs at Pirbright are being blamed for July's foot and mouth outbreak in Surrey. The piece reports that wastewater carrying the live virus entered the drainage pipework and then leaked out and contaminated the surrounding soil. The investigation for the official reports were carried out by a man who the article describes as a health and safety executive and professor, a man named Brian Spratt, who we will talk about later in this article. Anderson was the man who had trained the infamous Neil Ferguson, with whom he helped design and create the computer modeling program, which was first introduced during the foot and mouth disease outbreak in Britain 2 decades before COVID. Neil Ferguson, Anderson's apprentice. Over the past 2 decades, no one has made as many false predictions on potential pandemic numbers as Neil Ferguson. Ferguson obtained his Master of Arts degree in physics in 1990 at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and went on to study for his PhD in theoretical physics in 1994 at Linacre College, Oxford, where Roy Anderson was a Linacre a professor of zoology at the time, and who soon became Ferguson's teacher and mentor. It was also Oxford where Ferguson attended a lecture by the aforementioned close friend and former colleague of Roy Anderson, Sir Robert May, on modelling the HIV epidemic. It was after talking to Robert May at the presentation where Ferguson reportedly became interested in mathematical modelling of infectious diseases. It appears that from that moment on, Ferguson worked closely with Roy Anderson. Ferguson moved with Roy Anderson's group of infectious disease scientists from the University of Oxford to Imperial College in 2000. He also shifted his research focus to foot and mouth disease a few months before the crisis began, placing him in a prime position to immediately start working on modelling the FMD outbreak as it began. During the epidemic, Ferguson's unproven predictive models had successfully manufactured the consent needed to allow government to enact their brutal culling policy. Approximately 10 million animals were culled and burnt on pyres around the UK, with the size and scale of the cull causing serious public concern. As a 2006 paper, which is entitled Use and Abuse of Mathematical Models, an illustration from 2001 foot and mouth disease epidemic in the United Kingdom, which was produced by a team at Edinburgh University, states the experience should have been a warning of how models can be abused in the interest of scientific opportunism. Sorry. That paper, headed by one of the other government's scientific advisors during the start of FMD crisis, the aforementioned Dr. Kitching, included in its conclusion that modeling should only be countenanced if veterinarians and scientists agree that the design of the model and the information used to generate its results are correct and plausible from the known biology of the disease. Otherwise, models become exercises in mathematical sophistry. Ferguson's models had wreaked havoc on lives of millions of British farmers. Yet the following year, Neil Ferguson was honoured by the Queen with an OBE, Order of the British Empire, awarded to him for his service during the FMD crisis. The ashes of millions of slaughtered animals had barely settled before Neil Ferguson warned that sheep may have contracted BSE and that the disease could kill tens of thousands of people. He soon after produced a model of this new potential BSE outbreak, which he claims was just around the corner. Ferguson predicted the BSE would kill up to 150,000 people. The disease was only actually responsible for approximately 878 deaths. In that paper, again written alongside Roy Anderson and Crystal Donnelly, the author states, "We estimate the 95% confidence interval for future VCJD mortality to be 50 to 50,000 human deaths, considered exposure to bovine BSE alone, with the upper bound increasing to 150,000 once we include exposure from the worst case ovine sheep BSE scenario examined." Ferguson's inability to accurately predict anything correctly didn't stop him from continuing to make further predictions. In 2005, Ferguson predicted that deaths from bird flu worldwide would reach up to 200 million people, with the WHO eventually identifying a total of 455 deaths of probable attributable to the virus. During the 2009 swine flu pandemic in the UK, Ferguson predicted 65,000 deaths, while the actual number of deaths due to the disease was around 283. See a repeating theme here? In 2006, Ferguson began talking about the need to create vaccines quickly so to respond effectively to a pandemic he claimed was emerging with bird flu, stating in the press that even a border closure that is 99.9% effective only slowed the pandemic by a few weeks at the most. That doesn't buy you much time to make a vaccine, Ferguson said, going on to clarify, and that is what matters. The models show that if you could start giving people a vaccine based on the exact pandemic strain 30 days after it emerges, hitting 1% of the population a day, the maximum vaccine production rate, you might cut the number of cases by 97%. Of course, Neil Ferguson was wrong again, but his eagerness to predict mass death did not end there. Ferguson's claims of imminent bird flu pandemic also saw the House of Lords recommend passive immunization of bird flu if bird flu reached the UK. There he is. Oh, God, he's awful. On the 22nd of January 2020, Neil Ferguson was involved in the first meeting of SAGE, the UK's scientific advisory group. The minutes of the meeting weren't released until the 29th of May 2020 and were entitled simply Coronavirus COVID-19 Response. Also appointed to the advisory group was Wellcome Trust Director Jeremy Farrar. The SAGE group was chaired by the former President of Research and Development at GlaxoSmithKline, Patrick Vallance, who had left the global pharmaceutical giant in 2018 to become the United Kingdom scientific advisor. SAGE had already been set up by Sir Robert May, the man whose presentation had inspired Ferguson's career path over a decade prior, with their first meeting recorded in 2009 in response to the potential flu pandemic that never materialized and which Neil Ferguson's model falsely predicted mass global casualties, 200 million. Ferguson soon presented his computer models, which predicted 500,000 people would die of the COVID-19 vaccine virus in the UK alone. If this prediction turned out to be true, the large mortality number would have made COVID-19 pandemic one of the worst viruses in time immemorial. The fear and panic induced by his false prophetic vision helped manufacture consent for one of the most severe and restrictive of pandemic responses in history. Of course, the history books will also record that Neil Ferguson's COVID-19 modeling was not the only thing to cause concern. Ferguson was caught having an affair during COVID-19, whilst he was meant to be strictly observing the nationwide lockdown, which his models had forced on the rest of the country. On the 5th of May 2020, the UK Guardian newspaper reported that Ferguson resigns from SAGE after admitting error of judgment. Yes, error of judgment. The proximal origin of Jeremy Farrar. Jeremy Farrar is one of the most important members of the Wellcome Trust COVID cartel and was the initial reason I began investigating the Wellcome Trust. He has been vital in the planning, preparation, and the rollout of almost every part of the COVID-19 response in the UK and US, and there may be no other human on earth who has been so powerful during this crisis, and in turn so culpable for the disaster which has unfolded whilst he was at the helm. Because of his extremely significant and all-powerful role in COVID-19 agenda, I decided to go back further into the history of Jeremy Farrar than any other of the Wellcome Five. Actually, even further again. Eventually, I'll have eventually I'll have an article about going even further than this, going back to the 1800s. Very interesting. Like one of the most super interesting articles I've been working on for a while. I say that, it's all pretty interesting. I always say it all the time. Eric Mitchell Farrar was born on the 24th of August 1917, and by the time World War II had begun, he was 22 and at the prime age for conscription. In 1940, Eric joined the Duke of Wellington's West Riding Company, a unit named after Yorkshire Heartland. As a corporal, it wasn't long before Corporal Eric Farrar was reported as officially missing. Well, he was Yorkshire Heartland as a corporal. And it wasn't long before Corporal Eric Farrar was reported as officially missing, last being seen outside Dunkirk on the 11th of June 1940. On Friday, the 21st of August the same year, it was reported in the Bradford Observer in an article entitled Prisoners of War, Halifax and Huddersfield Man, stating that Corporal Eric M. Farrar, medical orderly, and Duke of Wellington's Regiment, Victoria Road, Lockwood, Huddersfield, is also reported to be a prisoner of war in Germany. It was later confirmed that Eric Farrar was being held at Stalag 383 Hohenfels in Bavaria, Germany, and later moved to Stalag 9C near Leipzig. On the 29th of March 1945, the camp where Eric was imprisoned was evacuated, and the prisoners of war were forced to march towards the Allied lines. The Germans used these prisoners in an attempt to slow the advancing Americans, with some of the prisoners being forced to march for 4 weeks before they were finally freed by US forces. Eric was debriefed and declared no longer a prisoner of war on the 31st of May 1945, and on the 11th of October 1945, his distinguished service was being acknowledged in the London Gazette. He was again honoured in 1946 in the Long Service and Good Conduct Awards. Jeremy's father and mother were interesting pair during World War II. Farrar's mother, Amy Annie Farrar, um, this is, yeah, Jeremy Farrar's, Amy Annie Farrar, born Melton, was also working for the army, driving army officials from bases in places like Scotland to various locations in the UK. On returning to Britain, Eric was driven from Scotland and on to the Ministry of Defence in London to pass on intelligence concerning the prisoner of war camp where he had been held. On this long journey, which would have taken the entire day to complete, Farrar's mother and father met for the first time and began their own lifelong journey. Always were even. It doesn't matter they produce Jeremy Farrar. People's journey makes me emotional. They married soon after their first meeting, officially tying the knot in North Kesteven in the county of Amy's birth, Lincolnshire, in June 1946. Described by Jeremy Farrar as itinerant in nature, his parents travelled the globe while they built up their family, which eventually extended to having 6 kids. Eric Farrar hadn't had the opportunity to go to university during the war, but he still became a teacher, working in various countries where they were based. Jeremy was born in Singapore on the 1st of February 1961, while his father was teaching there. But Farrar didn't grow up in Singapore, with the family moving to countries including New Zealand, Cyprus, Malaysia, Egypt, Yemen, and Libya. This wonderful tale of post-war jet-setting family is something I've seen over and over again when researching people who worked in intelligence. Although there is little evidence to show that Eric Farrar interacted with the MOD once even though although there is little evidence showing that Eric Farrar interacted with the MOD. Once he had have a harsh military experience, which had proven his mental endurance and stamina, officers he reported back to after the war. Okay, I'm not sure. I think I've got to edit that line. Uh-oh. Although there is little evidence showing that Eric Farrar interacted with the MOD, he did have harsh military experience, which had proved his mental endurance and stamina to officers he reported back to after the war. That once is rogue. His locations were where he settled are also suggestive of military placement, with Cyprus, Egypt, and Libya being prime places during this era to place assets. However, although I don't have direct evidence that Eric Farrar continued to work for the British state in any capacity, I do have reasons to be suspicious. You see, however neat and tidy Eric Farrar's family history appears, there's one glaring fact that has led me to believe that it's not as simple as it appears at first glance. If we are to believe what has been recorded, then Eric Farrar's mother and father were both 52 years old in 1917 when he was born. This is extremely unlikely, and even with all my experience in hunting ancestors, this is extremely likely, and even with all my experiences in hunting the ancestors of the powerful players, I have been unable to confirm the answer to this riddle, but I do have a hunch, and I've already almost written the article. Now I have, anyway. Jeremy Farrar was the 6th child of Eric and Amy Farrar, born in Singapore on the 1st of September 1961, where Amy was practicing her art and Eric was employed as a teacher in a local school. Jeremy lived in Cyprus, Libya, and New Zealand before he started his formal education in Britain. Initially educated at Churches College, which is described as an independent, fee-charging school, day school for girls and boys. And later he studied at University College London Medical School, where he obtained a Bachelor of Science degree in immunology in 1983 and a Bachelor of Medicine degree in 1986. Official sources state that Farrar completed his Doctor of Philosophy degree at University of Oxford in 1998 on myasthenia gravis. Oh God, you medical people are going to have a go at some of my pronunciation. Although Farrar has stated that he was finishing his first PhD from Oxford in 1994. In a TED Med presentation given 3 years before the current coronavirus began, Farrar describes a very important moment in his life in which he places linguistic emphasis on having occurred purely by chance. He states that in 1994 he had returned to Oxford University, where he was finishing his PhD, and that he was offered an opportunity to go live in Vietnam for a year, eventually staying for 18 years. He also claimed in 2014 Financial Times article that his decision to move to Vietnam was due to his disdain for conference halls full of white men. In reality, it is around this time that he was first recruited by the Wellcome Trust through an Oxford University initiative. Farrar was one of many scientists to be offered continuous funding throughout their entire career via lucrative research grants supplied by the Wellcome Trust. Many scientists were more than willing to move for such generous institution, willing to work for such a generous institution, which had seemingly unhooked themselves from the cutthroat world of private pharmaceutical industry. Farrar thrived in this culture of unlimited funding, and he was able to do more research in a country with less regulations in the United Kingdom. From 1996 until 2013, Farrar is recorded as being director of the Oxford University Clinical Research Unit in Ho Chi Minh City. Oxford University began being partners to much of the Wellcome Trust's efforts to recruit the best and brightest during the mid-1990s onwards. There he is, Jeremy Farrar, the TED Med meeting presentation, where he says about the by chance. How long is your ethics there, Jeremy? Oh, about that long. By 2009, Farrar found himself conveniently placed to respond to an emerging epidemiological crisis of the H5N1 virus in Asia and helped develop its origin story. To quote from a previous Unlimited Hangout investigation on the Trust's new Wellcome Leap venture, an article published by Rockefeller University Press Journal of Experimental Medicine in 2009 is dramatically titled Jeremy Farrar, When Disaster Strikes. Farrar, when referring to the H5N1 origin story, stated, the WHO people, and that is not a criticism, decided it was unlikely that the child had SARS or avian influenza. They left, but Professor Yan stayed behind to talk with the child and her mum. The girl admitted that she had been quite sad in the previous days with the death of her pet duck. The girl and her brother had fought over burying the duck, and because of this argument, she had gone back, dug up the duck, and reburied it, probably so her brother wouldn't know where it was buried. With that history, Professor Yan phoned me at home and said he was worried about the child. He took some swabs from the child's nose and throat and brought them back to the hospital. That night, the laboratory ran tests on the samples and they were positive for influenza A. This quaint tale of deadly duck seems plausible to most, although the local authorities were less convinced by Farrar and Hien's supposed new discovery. But what should thoroughly be noted is that Jeremy Farrar was regularly found at ground zero of various emerging global epidemiological threat responses. Although still based in Vietnam around 2009, Farrar was sent by Oxford to various locations around the globe to study other epidemics happening in real time, including subsequent global outbreaks of MERS 2012, Ebola 2014, and avian flu 2014. In 2013, he took up his directorship of the Wellcome Trust, a position he still retains. Stepped down recently, going to the WHO. During the Ebola crisis, Farrar also wrote papers such as Infectious Disease, Tough Choices to Reduce Ebola Transmission, alongside both Neil Ferguson and Chris Whitty. The latter headed up the official UK public relations side of the COVID-19 as a chief medical advisor to the UK government. In 2020, Farrar's incredible reach became exposed to the general public after the release of the Fauci emails. One of the infamous Fauci emails, dated 25th of February 2020 and sent by Amelie Rieu of The WHO, stated that Jeremy Farrar's official role at the time was to act as the board's focal point on the COVID-19 outbreak, to represent and advise the board on the science of the outbreak and the financing of the response. The Fauci emails also showed us that the preparation over a 10-day period of the paper entitled The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, which was accepted for publication by Nature magazine on March 17, 2020. The paper claimed that SARS-CoV-2 virus came from a natural origin as opposed to gain-of-function research. Farrar's supreme authority over the organization of COVID-19 response was beginning to be exposed to for the world to see, and soon people began questioning the scientific paper which he spearheaded as part of the major cover-up. Edward C. Holmes, Wellcome's man in China. Edward C. Holmes has significant connections to Jeremy Farrar and the Wellcome Trust, which made him a key figure in the creation of its origin paper. He is also a scientist who released the translated genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 on the 11th of January 2020. Holmes, who is currently a National Health and Medical Research Council Australian Fellow and a sitting professor at the University of Sydney, has had an impressive career. His CV shows that between 1994 to 1997, Holmes was a Wellcome Trust Fellow in Biodiversity Research at University of Oxford, UK. The link between Holmes and Farrar is far and away the most important connection in relation to Farrar's career. Starting in 1994, Holmes was tasked with the supervision of 35 graduate students with funding from various trusts, societies, and institutions, as well as being responsible for the allocation of some of the grants and seed funding. This is a position that Edward C. Holmes still occupies today. This apparent coincidence of Farrar and Holmes being at Oxford during the same period should be carefully studied. It appears that this is where Holmes may have originally given Farrar his first opportunity to begin his research in countries like Vietnam. There's Eddie Holmes. It isn't a surprise that Professor Edward Holmes' remit for recruiting potential graduates is to target the brightest. Some clues to the secretive recruitment process of Edward C. Holmes are found within his CV. They pick mainly Rhodes Scholars who usually study for their doctorate in philosophy at Oxford University. British scientific candidates are almost entirely funded by the Wellcome Trust throughout their careers, with the international members appearing to be mainly linked to Harvard, if not Oxford, and with many connections to those involved with Ebola crisis in 2014 and 2015. Edward C. Holmes' supervision of 35 graduate students since 1994 has been funded by the Rhodes Trust, the Wellcome Trust, the National Institute of Health, the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, the Australian Research Council, the American Psychological Council, the Biotechnology and Biological Science Research Council of the UK, and the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. Of course, it isn't surprising to see that the funding coming from outside the UK to help finance this professional grooming process originates from Australia, the US, and Canada, three countries which have enacted some of the most severe and far-reaching public policy choices throughout the COVID era. It should also be highlighted that Edward Holmes relocated to work in China just before the pandemic in 2019 as president at Fudan University. Okay, here we go. Notable mentions. Brian Spratt, sorry, Roy Anderson's right hand. Neil Ferguson had become Roy Anderson's shadow throughout large parts of his career, but he hasn't been Roy Anderson's only close friend, colleague, and collaborator. One of Roy Anderson's other right-hand men is a man who, although hasn't played a part in COVID-19 yet, has played many previous post-crisis roles during state-run cover-ups of publicly revealed state crimes, including helping to play down and hide the true extent of the UK Ministry of Defence's testing biological and chemical agents on their own population illegally, which is obviously very relevant to our current situation. During my initial preparation for this article, it became clear to me that before writing this piece, I first needed to investigate the previous 100 years of state-sanctioned crimes committed by the UK Ministry of Defence chemical and biological research projects at Porton Down. Porton Down, the British Centre for Virus Gain-of-Function Research and the scene of mass illegal human experimentation over the last century, has also had a relatively recent need to cover up their historic crimes. When looking at those obvious cover-ups, we can see many similarities which should give us cause for concern. Sorry, itchy back there. Ooh, just a little bit of an itch. In the late 90s, for instance, the Independent Safety Review was called to investigate the illegal secret mass human experimentation they had conducted on the British public after I told me to laugh at that. It's so ridiculous how clearly evil these guys are. After it was revealed that Porton Down scientists had been performing germ warfare experiments with live bacteria on British population for decades. The person put in charge of this review was Professor Brian Spratt. Spratt, when questioned over his ability to give an impartial view, told the BBC Spotlight programme in 1998, "I'm an independent microbiologist. I have no links to the Ministry of Defence. I wasn't chosen by the Ministry of Defence, so my independence is assured." Yet within a decade of the Independent Safety Review, Professor Brian Spratt was facing questions about his finding. In 2004, Professor Brian Spratt was asked about his Ministry of Defence commissioned report entitled Independent Review of Possible Health Hazards of Large-Scale Release of Bacteria During the Dorset Defence Trials. It had been discovered that the Ministry of Defence had not submitted details of 24 other germ warfare tests to Professor Spratt for the Ministry of Defence commissioned review. Spratt claimed that he had not received all the information, but he'd happily look at it if it was provided. Of course, by that time it was too late to be included in the evidence of the review. There's Spratt saying, "Oh, I don't know about this evidence. Ooh, didn't get told." The House of Lords presented a clear rundown of Spratt's findings. From his original report in the debate titled Spratt Report, South Coast Biological Defence Trials, with the debate taking place on the 9th of February 1999, Lord Gilbert announced, pardon me, Professor Brian Spratt has now completed his review of the microbiological defense trials conducted along the South Coast in the 1960s and 1970s. The Ministry of Defense welcomes his main findings. That the trials would have caused no harm to the vast majority of people. That although there may have been an unquantifiable risk of infection in a small number of people who had serious underlying diseases such as cystic fibrosis, any such infections would have been infections of the chest or blood and would have occurred within days of release of the bacteria. That it was extremely unlikely that there is any link between bacteria released in the trials and the health problems reported by people who have suffered chronic ill health, miscarriages, and who have had children with disabilities. An unbelievable finding. Honestly, unbelievable. The evidence that wasn't handed over to the MOD for this review was completely damning and revealed the damage that had been caused by their E. coli experiments, as well as spraying of Britain with a known chemical carcinogen. A quote from my previous article entitled Porton Down's Ideological Cloud, the Toxic Secret Experiments on Millions of British People. To quote it, Porton Down was supposedly testing out how vulnerable Britain actually was to germ warfare by attacking its own population. Zinc cadmium sulfide was known to be highly toxic, with cadmium causing birth defects, which have been well noted in laboratory experiments on rats, as well as being heavily carcinogenic. In August 1959, the Royal Air Force aircraft flew above the North Sea before changing course to fly along the English Channel, spraying the compound as it flew. The Ministry of Defence, what many referred to as were as what many referred to as today as chemtrailing the south coast of England. The records of readings taken during the experiment show that the majority of the chemicals released were taken by the wind in a northeasterly direction. But when the plane reached the end of its flight path, the remaining chemicals were dumped out in concentrations 1,000 times greater than anywhere else in the country. The people of Dorchester and the nearby town of East Lulworth had been dusted with what can only be described as death particles from above. These coastal Dorset tourist hotspots would have been full of many visitors during the peak of summer, but it's studying the obvious consequences of Porton Down and Ministry of Defence human experimentation had on the residents of East Lulworth, which could break even the hardest heart. Although the folks at Porton Down won't take a proper look at the evidence, the residents of East Lulworth have suffered from miscarriages, birth defects, as well as all manner of other health issues affecting them and their children, with at least 21 families affected. Even though Spratt had no obvious and clear links to the Ministry of Defence at the time he conducted his review, he was funded by the Wellcome Trust during that period and throughout his entire career. It's worth noting that the former Wellcome Trust director, Roy Anderson, a close colleague and friend of Spratt's, eventually took up formal work with the Ministry of Defence. Spratt's heading of the Ministry of Defence review was not his only establishment task. On the 12th of January 2001, it was announced that Professor Spratt, who was at the time based at Wellcome Trust Centre for Epidemiology of Infectious Disease at University of Oxford, became the chair of the Royal Society's Working Group on Depleted Uranium. In the early 1990s, the UK Ministry of Defence needed to rebrand its Porton Down facilities along with the wider biological and chemical weapons research programs due to the fact that Porton Down was facing public pressure like they had never experienced before. This owed to four key historic crimes that came to light around this period. First was the decades of spraying the aforementioned cancerous compound zinc cadmium sulfide from military aircraft, cars, ships, and trains on an unwitting British public. Second was the spraying of E. coli germs from boats in the southwest of England, and further complaints of birth defects, miscarriages, and other health issues resulting from these experiments. Third was their experimentation on humans with nerve gas, which eventually led to inquiry which exposed these actions publicly. Fourth was the Anthrax Island debacle, which became a PR disaster for the organization. The Ministry of Defence needed a few good men who they could rely on to help control these and other cover-ups in the future. Although Brian Spratt has not yet been directly involved with the COVID-19 response publicly, his previous history suggests he could potentially be rolled out in the event of official inquests and/or inquiries. Professor Spratt appears to fit a profile similar to the other of two other of Roy Anderson's apprentices, Jeremy Farrar and Edward C. Holmes, who are discussed in detail later on in this investigation. They might already be discussed. Spratt, almost entirely Wellcome Trust funded, connected to both Oxford and Imperial College, and he had been put in charge of extremely sensitive establishment projects, in this case, official cover-ups. In investigating Professor Sir Brian Spratt more thoroughly, I found his many connections with Roy Anderson, the man who had also been the mentor of Farrar and Holmes, the man connected with almost every single group active in the global COVID totalitarian control structure currently dictating policy worldwide. Roy Anderson was governor and director of the Wellcome Trust during the era Spratt, Farrar, and Holmes were all brought into the fold. Oh, we're getting through it now, baby. Andrew Rambeau and Christian G. Anderson, the Proximal Origin Cleanup Crew. I'd originally I had originally started out by building uh, a picture of who these people were by looking at their families, schooling, career history, affiliations, and associations to try and see any potential patterns which could help build a basic profile of these top table appointees. It cannot be understated. The individuals explored thus far in this article took up key roles, and their task was viewed as an incredibly sensitive one for those who have been driving the COVID agenda. If we are to unravel the larger control network, we must build a profile of the people involved, as doing so is vital in aiding our recognition of other players. In this case, that necessary profile was very easy to form thanks to the publication of the proximal origins of SARS-CoV-2 paper. There are some very interesting scientists who were involved in the creation of the SARS-CoV-2 paper. The first being a man that fits the profile for one of the special 35 graduates who receive almost all their career-long funding from the Wellcome Trust initiative that has been managed by Holmes since 1994. Andrew Rambeau is a British evolutionary biologist who, as of 2020, held the position of Professor of Molecular Evolution at University of Edinburgh. If you were to look at the official Wikipedia entry for Mr. Rambeau, you notice that there is, as of writing this, no mention of his participation in the SARS-CoV-2 paper. However, if you were to search his wiki page's history, you discover that all mention of his part in the origin paper have been removed by a computer with the IP address 92.238.235.86. Which is also coincidentally based in Edinburgh. The aforementioned IP addresses edits have also included changes on SARS-CoV-2 wiki entry, suggesting that these actors are still successfully altering the public information. Andrew Rambeau is a relatively young man. He has his entire career ahead of him. So why he agreed to being involved in such a nefarious scheme, which was bound to be uncovered in the end? So why did he agree? One obvious reason why Andrew Rambeau was chosen by Farrar is because it was very much in Professor Rambeau's financial interest to do so. The reason why Jeremy Farrar and his Wellcome friends are so important to the establishment cannot be understated. Farrar and the philanthropic Wellcome Trust funds a large amount of expensive research, including projects led by Andrew Rambeau. Only 2 years prior to COVID-19 pandemic, in January 2018, Farrar's Wellcome Trust had been funding Professor Andrew Rambeau's research. In fact, almost all of Andrew Rambeau's research has funding links to the Wellcome Trust. Since taking part in the fake COVID origins paper, Rambeau has taken center stage at some Wellcome Trust events. Between 13th and 15th of December 2021, Professor Andrew Rambeau was a guest speaker for the Wellcome Trust Wellcome Connecting Science Conference on Virus Genomics and Evolution. The Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute had also published a case study authored by Andrew Rambeau in 2017, as well as other past collaborations published while Farrar has been leading the Wellcome Trust. Christian G. Anderson's input in the origin paper, organized by Farrar, is bizarre. Even though Anderson put his name on the paper, he was noted in the Fauci emails as studying the virus, and with the help of a small team, coming to the conclusions that it was in fact man-made. In the Fauci emails, Anderson states clearly, after discussions earlier today, Eddie, Bob, Mike, and myself all find the genome inconsistent with the expectations from evolutionary theory. So, what made Professor Christian Anderson become involved in the scientific paper, which was very soon after which was very soon after to come to the opposite conclusion? By February 2020, Christian Andersen found himself having to defend his actions publicly, something none of these scientists seemed to have been expecting. Andersen claimed that the emails to Anthony Fauci, showing that he had found a viral genome to be inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory, was simply a clear example of the scientific process. There was no way for Anderson to avoid confronting the Fauci emails once they were published, with Professor Roger Pelk of University of Colorado Boulder asking Anderson on Twitter to explain what all find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory actually means in layman's terms. Anderson's response was to double down on the original findings by stating, it specifically means we thought on preliminary look that the virus could have been engineered and or manipulated. Turns out the data suggests otherwise, which is the conclusion of the paper. In a further tweet, Anderson stated, conspiracies have created a narrative where we all dismissed it, the lab leak hypothesis, out of hand, stating that the very idea was absurd and couldn't be further from the truth. It's just the data don't support the hypothesis. So knowing now that the lab leak theory is being accepted as probable source, we can only conclude that either Professor Christian Andersen is really incompetent at his job, or he was complicit in creation of fake science conjured up in an attempt to hide the true origins of SARS-CoV-2. That's Christian Andersen and Bob Gary there. Although at first glance, it may appear that Anderson has no obvious links to Wellcome Trust, his postdoctoral advisor at Harvard-linked Broad Institute was Pardis Sabeti, who I will mention shortly. Anderson heads up Scripps Research, Anderson Lab, which also includes external research contributions from fellow Proximal Origin paper authors Andrew Rambeau and Bob Gary. There are more. There are many more people standing center stage in the COVID-19 response who have strong ties to the Wellcome Trust and the so-called Wellcome Five. In forming a profile to aid in the hunt for potential matches for others who have significant links to those covered in the article so far, it became clear that many who are a perfect match are some of the movers and shakers behind the COVID-19 agenda. Before I conclude this piece, let's look at three individuals who are tied in multiple ways to our band of scientific totalitarian elites. Devi Sridhar, you know her. I think she's deleted her Twitter. Devi Sridhar is described as an American public health researcher and is based at the University of Edinburgh along with Andrew Rambeau. She fits the profile of someone the Wellcome Five would target for recruitment for various reasons. Devi was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, completing an MPhil in medical anthropology in 2005, following by a DPhil in anthropology in 2006. She's also part of the UK Scientific Advisory Group, SAGE, and has previously worked with the Harvard Global Health Institute and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which assesses international responses to the 2014 Ebola outbreak. Sridhar also compiled the first Wellcome Trust open research collection on the topic of global public health during COVID-19. Sridhar was added to the Scottish Government's time-limited expert group set up on the 25th of March 2020 to help develop and improve its plan for handling the COVID-19 pandemic in Scotland. Sridhar also co-authored an open letter in The Lancet on the 15th of October 2020, which has been referred to as the John Snow Memorandum. This is terrible. The letter calls for science-based public health policy and rejects naturally acquired herd immunity as a dangerous fallacy. The letter received 2,000 signatures from the science and healthcare community within 24 hours and appears to revise everything we know about naturally acquired herd immunity. Schroeder also worked with Chelsea Clinton and used principal agent theory to study the global fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria and the Gavi Alliance. There she is, Debbie Schroeder. Would not trust her at all. Beth Shapiro is described as an American evolutionary molecular biologist and is possibly one of the biggest female names in science today. She's a Rhodes Scholar and completed a DPhil at Oxford. She's also a MacArthur Fellow, known as the Genius Grant, and is also a Wellcome Trust Research Fellow. She has the prestigious title of being Director of Henry Wellcome Biomolecules Center. Beth Shapiro's most recent book, Life as We Made It, attempts to assuage public fear surrounding risky advances in biotechnology. The website reaction.life stated in their review of the book, this book brings readers up to date assessing the impact on research of the COVID-19 event and the appetite for adopting riskier technologies more quickly. Unbelievable, there she is. Beth Shapiro, unbelievable. All of them. Taking advantage. They all are. They all want extra money, don't they? Pardis Sabeti worked on Ebola which links her to Farrar, Holmes, Rambo, and Sridhar. During the Ebola outbreak, she and her team helped sequence the virus behind Ebola using data from infected patients. She is described as an Iranian-American computational biologist, medical geneticist, and evolutionary geneticist. She was a Rhodes Scholar and previously studied at both Harvard and Oxford. She has in the past been funded from the Wellcome Trust, is an expert on genomic sequencing, and has links to Elon Musk and Eric Lander. Sabeti, as previously mentioned, was also Christian G. Anderson's postdoctoral advisor at Harvard-linked Broad Institute. During COVID-19, Sabeti has been creating digital tech surveillance with the Broad Institute's MIT research team. Through the engineering of a symptom tracking app called Scout, when referring to the data collection aspect of the digital tool, Sabeti stated, it's definitely the kind of analytics that people talk about having, but nobody has access to in this way. In the past, Sabeti has also written papers with Proximal Origin paper creator Robert Gary and her apprentice Christian G. Anderson, and there she is again. This Betty. There you go. This small sample group of actors are all involved in some way with the global coronavirus pandemic response and the future plans and preparations for such events. They fit the profile of the kind of graduates who were groomed with long-term financial and career incentives by Edward C. Holmes and his colleagues, as well as having various links with the Wellcome Five. Here we go. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. We're at the end now. We're at the last part of this. We're going to have a little stretch. Say, like, share, and subscribe when you have a chance. Please donate if you can. Buy me a coffee if you can. Become a patron if you can. Regular subscribers are much appreciated. If you subscribe to me, you also get your name in lights. You'll be on the next series of Searching for Stanley and the documentary that follows. You can watch Searching for Stanley now. By the time this comes out, the feature length version will also be out on this channel, Johnny Vedmore on YouTube, and in docu-series form on NEWSPASTE. The Wellcome Five. Well, here we go. Proximal origin of COVID controllers. The Wellcome Five's Royal Society HQ. The Wellcome Five are Sir Roy Anderson, FRS, Sir Richard Sykes, FRS, Sir Jeremy Farrar, FRS, Edward C. Holmes, FRS, and Neil Ferguson, OBE, FRS-S. and they have been aided by others featured in this piece: Sir Brian Spratt, FRS, Andrew Rampo, Crystal Donnelly, CPE, FRS, Sir Robert May, FRS, Baron of Oxford, Sir John Krebs, FRS, with a special guest appearance from Christian G. Anderson. These 11 scientists were central to the events outlined in this article, which focused on the evolution of the pandemic control response, specifically within the United Kingdom, but with significant global reach, especially in the US. One thing you may notice from my list of members who make up the Wellcome Five and their friends is that most of them have three letters after their name. The FRS placed after someone's name denotes that they are a fellow of the Royal Society. The Royal Society is a very elite and prestigious British scientific institution, which has given membership to almost every one of these scientists. Notably, Ferguson is a Fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, and Rambo took up the Royal Society University Research Fellowship position and became Chair of Molecular Evolution at the University of Edinburgh in 2010, being later elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2014. The Royal Society has thousands of members, made up of, only a few thousand, made up of the most famous figures of the elite, scientific elite, including individuals like David Attenborough and Elon Musk, as well as historic members such as Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein. Whilst researching this article, the Royal Society came up over and over again. Although not all the members of such an organization are aware of the more nefarious activities happening within their group, it appears as though a small number of their ranks are provably involved in planning, creating, and implementing large parts of the authoritarian control structure put in place during COVID-19. Two members of the Wellcome Cartel, who will be a central figure to future investigations, are the men responsible for recruiting and managing the Wellcome Trust linked team, which created this medical dystopia. Sir John Krebs, son of famous Jewish German scientist Hans Adolf Krebs, and Sir Robert May, one of the presidents of the Royal Society. Both are well-respected scientists and fellows of the Royal Society. And they've just got a very quickly note down something that's come to me. See, this is journalism in action. I'm just thinking. I should make a note of those things that I'm thinking. Sir Robert May is the more important of these two in relation to this investigation in particular, as the evidence shows that he has significant links to the recruitment of the men profiled in this article, including the former Royal Society president, Robert May, being the reason Neil Ferguson says he chose his career path, as well as co-authoring 2 books alongside his friend Roy Anderson. The fact that every one of these people I have investigated have some links to the Royal Society should make us all ask questions about this powerful reach of such a historic institution, which is consistently involved in obscure ways with public policy concerning science and technology. The Royal Society appears to be a major base of operations for groups which are driving the type of scientific research which, if examined honestly and openly, cannot muster public support, let alone gain assured public consent. Without a doubt, we are living through a moment in history which will be studied for many decades to come. In a world awash with a mass of information, it is only a matter of time before a detailed picture of these events form. For this investigation, I had originally focused on the events which had been emblematic of the entire official COVID-19 response, the Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2 paper. That notorious scientific paper, published in the prestigious Nature, saw the scientists involved enter into an absurd public spectacle, which many onlookers can clearly see is one of the most defining moments of COVID-19 era. It's very similar to the dodgy dossier produced by the British government during the run-up to Iraq War. It is a very significant historical moment in our shared human experience. The establishment appears to have been caught off guard and were possibly expecting that their efforts at censorship and social coercion during COVID-19 could actually wipe out the majority of dissent, and that the constant drama held people's attention for long enough for the commencement of some other distracting major event. Whilst some of the Wellcome Five are behind many of the most important parts of the Anglo-American response to COVID-19, their manufacturing of SARS-CoV-2 proximal origin paper was an attempt to cover up the true origins of a pandemic from the entire global population. This small group of close friends and colleagues went to extraordinary lengths in an attempt to pull off the scientific heist of the millennium by conspiring to steal the truth behind COVID-19 from the people of the world. But in the end, they have been utterly exposed, and every person on this globe should be demanding that the core of this wealthy scientific elite be held criminally responsible for the unsuccessful cover-up of SARS-CoV-2, as well as the commencement of a complete, transparent, full investigation and review of the Wellcome Trust's many scientific programs around the world. That's really important. I know that there's a lot of information here to digest, but if you've been paying close enough attention, then it's important. The important issue is clearly visible. Computer modeling could be used to change the world, improve lives, and help to predict the outcomes of complicated, data-intensive events such as pandemics. But instead, we have computer modeling being used to deceive the majority of the population by creating a constant and intense fear of impending doom so as to control public opinion. It's not the sophistication of any tool that will predict a given outcome. It will always be the competence and integrity of those who wield that said tool which will lead us to the eventual conclusion. In 2000, Roy Anderson, Neil Ferguson, and Crystal Donnelly changed facilities and turned their attention to an animal disease which had been absent in the UK for over 3 decades. Alongside the second foot and mouth disease outbreak, which was accepted as coming from a lab leak, and their actions during COVID crisis, it's hard to give these viciously dangerous establishment actors the benefit of the doubt and not automatically assume that the 2001 foot and mouth disease outbreak was actually either a purposely manufactured event or simply another lab leak. What is very relevant in relation to the links between the official response to FMD and that of COVID-19 is that the possible practice run as the possible practice run for the main event resulted in the unnecessary culling of millions of creatures. In time, we may see that reckless global experimental vaccine drive has had exactly the same outcome. This small group of elite scientists seem to have been instrumental in the origin story of many of the modern outbreaks. And from what we know now about the veracity of the proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2 paper, it should make us question and re-examine all other origin stories any of these people have seeded into the annals of history. These people are using some of the most dangerous biological agents known to man with blatant disregard and no reverence for the potential harm which these infectious agents could do to all life on Earth. In 2014, The Guardian reported that the Health and Safety Executive revealed that more than 70 incidents of government, university, and hospital labs were serious enough to investigate lab leaks. Incidents that, many led to enforcement letters or Crown Prohibition Notices, CPN, ordering labs to shut until improvements were made. Some were so serious they ended in legal action. The situation we are faced with is unnecessarily precarious, and none of us should feel comfortable while this is considered the normal state of affairs. If we continue on this path, it is only a matter of time before something much worse than COVID-19 escapes from one of the many poorly managed government laboratories which are dotted all around the world. With the fourth industrial revolution at our doorstep, We have entered into an era of boundless possibilities, and every part of our societal structure is experiencing of our social structure is experiencing fundamental changes, which will be nigh on impossible to roll back once implemented. Yet, whilst having one foot in the future, we also have one foot firmly stuck in a muddy past. These archaic and shadowy institutions, such as the Wellcome Trust, the Rhodes Trust, and many more, the Royal Society, have become fundamental in pushing forward the scientific community's necessary and unnecessary endeavors alike. Behind the facade of a historic philanthropic organization, the Wellcome Trust has become an unaccountable behemoth, capable of taking control of health policies and protocols in response to any real or potentially manufactured health crisis. What should be even more concerning is that these men have often appeared to be expecting and preparing for these events to happen beforehand and are hoisted quickly into key positions to act as the vanguard to responses which should only be the remit of elected officials rather than so-called philanthropists. The main concern for us all should be the glaring warning signs that the same old agenda of population control via mass extermination is rearing its ugly head again. Fundamentally, a few unelected men should not have this much sway over public health policies. They shouldn't become more powerful than a prime minister or a president with zero public consent. And if they want to be given this level of influence on public policy, they should be 100% transparent and entirely accountable. We currently do not have an effective structure in place which is capable of safeguarding some of the most basic human rights. And do not be deceived, our system is built that way on purpose. When the Nuremberg Code was designed and put into writing, it should have also been adopted as a strict set of laws and regulations which could never be broken. Instead, after watching the pharmaceutical elite indulge in their mass human medical experimentation fetish, we again stand on the doorstep of genocide with very little protection from those who wish to slaughter us like cattle. Ooh! Author's dedications. That's me. I'm the author of this. This piece is dedicated to every woman who has had a miscarriage due to being biologically or chemically experimented on by the government scientists of the world. I promise I will never forget what they have stolen from you. Author's acknowledgements. Past Johnny snuck up on me with that one. Thanks to the people trying to piece together the Fauci emails aside of this over at formosahat.com. And it can be a real adventure to follow, and their research helped me on a few things. A big thank you to the person who once started Warmwell's site, which was a very valuable resource, although it's now available only through the archives. Got to give a big thanks to you, the people who keep supporting me and keep getting this information out there. Sometimes we in the independent media are screaming into the proverbial wind to get our voices heard. And your help and support is literally my oxygen, and I love you all. You can share on Twitter, Facebook, or whatever. You can like it. I did a couple of people who commented. I didn't even know comments were open. You can become a patron and buy me a coffee. You've got some trending articles, and you can also at the end of here you can drop me some bucks via PayPal. Buying me a coffee is also a very good way. PayPal, coffee. There's also a support section with extra parts on. Wow, I choked up at the end there. So that was it. Look at those guys. You see, that's a long article. I mean, we've been taking a long time there, but it was an important article to write. And once I realized what I was looking at, was, let me change it. Let me stop the share. What I was looking at was the cover up. Everybody else was watching the birdie, I feel. So the American side was the birdie. Like, I mean, I suppose it's that, isn't it? Watch a birdie for me, and then you come in with the other side, watch a birdie, bang. And the real punch was coming from the Wellcome Trust linked contingent, Oxford Wellcome linked contingent. They were unaccountable in all sorts of ways, responsible at such a high level, above presidents, above prime ministers, above the health officials. They were given the responsibility completely unaccountable in another country. Why the Americans haven't really held Farrar's feet to the fire? Oh, that's because it's Royal Society. No way. The Americans just get awestruck when they get to the Royal Society anyway. And it's a disgusting institution if it's allowed to, it seems like governments go to the Royal Society to get those guys to do things so they can get away with their things, and then they're not accountable. So it's very clever. Very clever. It's used as a proxy so that we don't get to hold these people to account during the most important time, during this whole experimenting on humans, all of this sort of stuff. This is a time where they've an unaccountable body from outside your country is deciding on the most important things in the world, and you don't even know. You don't even know who they are. You're still watching the birdie. Still watching the birdie. Does anybody in America, apart from the people who are right up on top of the scientific community or people who read this article, do they know about Richard Sykes? Do they know his importance? Do they know about Roy Anderson and his inventing the computer modeling in general, what we use nowadays? They know Neil Ferguson's name. They know Jeremy Farrar a little bit, but do they know their importance and their relative? Do they know Edward C. Holmes? All these little names that pop up that they don't think have any relevance, but all have a massive connection. And that's why I felt this was the punch. These are the punch boys. The rest was just all watching birdies. Like, everybody's just keep it looking across and saying, "Oh yeah, these people do all of these things. Look, it's all those people," and they're not even seeing the people who are written down there in the Fauci emails. As Jeremy Farrar is the one who takes over everything. There's the article I wrote before. I'm going to do a read through of that eventually. It's a fairly competent article. This one was 15,000 words. There's still a couple of mistakes, even though that I've gone through it a couple of times. There's still a couple of mistakes because I don't have like at this stage as well. I didn't really have the drafting experience to be able to do it properly. So a lot of this is me just like, I'm an amateur. Especially earlier on, I was an amateur journalist compared to most. But that's because I was trying to aim at something really high and that no one else was doing, and it had to be done. So sorry if it's bitty here and there. But it's a really important article. The Wellcome Five. I just still don't think, people like I've talked to loads of different people in the medical community who appreciated this, like people who are respected around the place, who really appreciate this article. A couple of them, like one of them in particular, photo like got on a video call with me and was just like, what, it made me realize what I was like swimming through when I was in my career. And lots of other people have said roughly the same thing. They're like, oh wait, so that's what that person's role was. Well, they came into my life and then they disappeared again. So it's like extremely important article to write, not only for me, but for the people of the scientific community who were missing that part of the puzzle. And it was really appreciated. That part of the puzzle was really appreciated because no one else went there. Just why no one else went there, I don't know. I know that Vanessa Beeley did a little bit about Roy Anderson's involvement in the foot and mouth crisis around the same time. But I didn't really notice that till afterwards because I was too. I'm very much. I don't look at what other journalists at the time. I look for evidence. So I'm not looking at what other journalists are saying until after I've written the piece, and then I put it all together, and then I do all my checks over the top. Then I check out what other people have done. So I was like, I saw the way she handled that, and it was like, it was a very good explainer of different parts of foot and mouth. But it's really, I look at the infrastructure, the bosses at top, and who's pushing these pieces and playing the game, who's the one who's pushing the game out there. And so this was something where, like, the Wellcome Five was massively important. It's a shame it didn't get out quicker. I really wanted it to get out quicker, but there's another part. There's another part coming. I'm trying to see if UK Column wants it. But I go back into Farrar's history. Whew, unbelievable. Like, the past is unbelievable. It'll blow your mind. Blow your mind. Again, it'll blow your mind. Blow your mind. I'll show you COVID-19 over 100 years ago. I'll show you the same things happening. The same family, the same person, basically. Same genetic strand doing exactly the same things. Unbelievable. I mean, really unbelievable. Blow your mind. And that's why I love doing this sort of stuff, because I keep getting my mind blown by this information. Like, what? Oh my God. But that, and I wonder why other people don't necessarily see it. But it's hard. It's hard. There's so much to see. And everybody gets caught along the way. I go traveling back in time, and I try and get like uber context about everything. I get uber contextual. I want to know about this person now, so I find about how he got there through like his ancestors and stuff. And what I do is I learn so much more than I think I was going to learn at the start. And so I go a really super long route, and that means I don't get stuck back there. When I'm starting in the future and I'm going back to the past, I don't get stuck in the future. I don't get stuck at that point. Oh God, look, that person did that. I got aim at that person. I look back and I go, okay, I see that person. Let's go back, see what else I find, and then I see that person now, and then go back, and then like this with this, it was like, Farrar. I'm looking into Farrar. I part wrote the Welcome Leap article with Whitney Webb on Unlimited Hangout. And it's written at the end that I helped write it instead of co-authoring, because that's what Whitney did. And the sections that I wrote was really the Farrar section, and really focused on I did a lot of research on Farrar, and I was just like, wow, I found loads of things. And then it was trying to unpick them and unpack them was really hard. Took a bit of time to do that, and then it led to this. It led to me discovering about who Jeremy Farrar really is. I almost said someone who I think is one of his ancestors names, because he's the same person. You'll learn about that eventually. I found Farrar really interesting then, and the more I dug away at who he was, the more I had to go back in time. The more I went back in time, the more these other names kept coming up. And then I realized I was on the track of something. I couldn't work out what it was at first, until I had like a really small group of people who were really the most important. It's so vital to really key parts of the causing this COVID pandemic to go out of control and lead to experimental vaccines being authorized across the world, with no sort of accountability for these bloodthirsty scientists who were desperate to make this happen before. I mean, if you look at 200 million, the Ferguson was saying, and it was nowhere near that for bird flu, I think it was. So you've got this constant. They wanted to spark a pandemic, and then eventually that worked. He tried over and over again to make people afraid. And maybe if we were weak in society, or the time was right, it was better for them to manipulate back in 2006, 7, 8, 9, that they would have sparked something back then. But I think people were fed up with the wars going on. Iraq, Afghanistan, there was too many psyops. Everybody was confused and distracted, that they didn't really need something on top. It's almost like that'll only work once the government needs to distract from a load of other things. Then they'll start accepting panic easier, you know, whether it be panic about a virus or panic about terrorism or panic about what. They'll accept panic easier if they know that eventually it's going to meet their ends. And that's it. It's a long one. This was the longest Johnny Vedmore read through so far. I hope you enjoyed it. And please like, share, subscribe, come support my work, buy me a coffee, give me a tip, whatever way you can support my work. I need your help. I don't get paid by big people because I write stories like this, because I write articles like this, like get taken down from places, get hidden from places, get censored. I need your help. You help me, I'll write more articles, I'll do more Johnny Vedmore read-throughs, and I'll dance. I'll dance for you. Oh, yes. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and you have a lovely time, a lovely day.
Shaping a great reset for the post-corona era.